The call came at noon. Bruce was training alone at his Cumberland Roadhouse when the message was relayed. A Soviet combat specialist, serious credentials, requesting a private session. No cameras, no spectators beyond essential witnesses. Professional curiosity between two serious men. Bruce listened, said nothing for several seconds. Then, tomorrow, 4 o'clock, here. The 9 witnesses who assembled that afternoon were an accidental congregation. 2 of Bruce's most trusted training partners, men who had seen him at his most unleashed and still sometimes struggled to process what they'd witnessed. 2 quiet members of Kozlov's delegation, a film producer, a local martial arts instructor Bruce had been mentoring for months, a journalist who had been at the house for an unrelated meeting and simply hadn't left yet, and 2 others whose names have never appeared in any account. Nobody asked them to line the walls. They just did, some instinct moving them to the edges of the room, to create space, to not be in the center of whatever was coming. Kozlov arrived exactly on time. He was larger in person than described. He moved with the deliberate economy of a man who had spent years understanding his own body as a system. No wasted motion, no performance, nothing nervous. He wore plain, dark training clothes. He bowed his head when he entered. Respectful, not deferential. Bruce was already standing near the center of the room, arms loose, plain white t-shirt, dark trousers. He looked, to anyone who didn't know him, like the significantly smaller man. One witness later said the contrast was almost comic, like someone had brought a scalpel to a sledgehammer contest. They were wrong about which instrument was which. The 2 men stood facing each other, and the room went completely silent. Kozlov broke it. Measured voice, no hostility. "I've studied your method. I believe there is a counter. I want to test it, with full respect." Bruce didn't answer immediately. He looked at Kozlov, not at his eyes, at all of him, the way Bruce always read opponents, scanning weight distribution, shoulder angle, the micro-signals of how a body intends to move before it moves. Then, "Tell me the counter." Kozlov laid it out, calmly, professionally. The absorption strategy, the distance collapse, the neutralization through mass. Bruce listened with no expression. When Kozlov finished, there was a pause that the witnesses said felt longer than it was. Then Bruce said, "It's a good theory." He said it without irony, without condescension. He said it the way a teacher acknowledges a student's logic before revealing the part of the equation they couldn't see. Let's find out if it's true.
They squared off. No formal signal, no referee, no countdown. The room simply compressed into absolute stillness. Kozlov had made his decision in the 2 seconds before he moved. He would not wait. Waiting gave Lee time to dictate terms. He would go first, go fast, absorb whatever initial contact came, and get his arms around that 130-pound frame before a second strike could land. His entire preparation had been engineered for this moment. He launched. 230 pounds of trained military specialist, driving forward with genuine speed, genuine commitment, every gram of his body mass accelerating toward a man who was less than half his weight. What happened next took 3 seconds. 3 seconds that 9 people have spent years trying to reconstruct, and whose accounts never fully align, because human perception is not built for that speed. The eye registers, the brain logs, but there is always a gap. And in that gap, the thing had already happened. What the witnesses agree on, Kozlov moved forward. Bruce did not move back. He moved sideways, a fraction, diagonal, a displacement so small it registered as almost nothing, until suddenly it was everything. The angle changed. That 230-pound forward drive, built on full commitment and momentum, found empty air where it expected to find resistance. And in the microsecond of that miscalculation, Bruce Lee's body was already somewhere else entirely. The first strike, most witnesses say a palm heel to the side of the neck. 2 say it was the edge of a forearm, connected with Kozlov's neck. Not a finishing blow, a disruption, a precise interruption of the signal chain between Kozlov's brain and his moving body. The second strike landed on the solar plexus. This one every witness agrees on completely, because the sound it made was unlike anything a training room normally produces. Not a padded thud, not the crack of a misplaced blow. Something structural, something deep. Kozlov's forward momentum did not slow. It stopped. 230 pounds of forward-moving mass stopped cold by a man who weighed 130.
Kaslov's body folded from the point of impact. His hands dropped. His knees buckled 4 inches without collapsing as his diaphragm spasmed and his nervous system tried to process what had been done to it. He did not fall, but he was finished. The entire exchange, from Kaslov's launch to the moment his body stalled, lasted 3 seconds. The room held its breath for 10 more after that.
Bruce stepped back to where he'd started, arms at his sides, white t-shirt undisturbed, breathing unchanged. He looked at Kaslov with an expression that wasn't triumph and wasn't contempt. Something quieter, something that looked almost like patience. Kaslov stood, slowly, carefully, and straightened. He stayed in place for several seconds, his hands on his knees, his body recalibrating. Then he stood fully upright. He looked at Bruce Lee across the distance between them, and he nodded, once, slowly. The kind of nod that doesn't need a word attached to it, because the word would only make it smaller. Nobody in that room spoke for almost a full minute. The witnesses along the walls didn't move. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who had just watched something that rewired their understanding of what a human body could do and needed a moment to let the rewiring complete. One of Bruce's training partners later said it was the quietest he'd ever seen a room get after something violent, because it hadn't felt violent exactly. It had felt precise, like watching a surgeon, like watching someone reach into a mechanism and stop it without breaking it. Kaslov, to his considerable credit, did not make excuses. Before he left, he approached Bruce and spoke to him privately. The witnesses were too far to hear the words. What they could see was Bruce listening, then responding, then both men standing in what looked like a genuine conversation between equals. Whatever was said stayed in that room, but one of Kaslov's delegation, years later, in a private setting in Leningrad, reportedly told the story this way. Kaslov had told Bruce that his theory was correct, the counter was logical, and Bruce had told him that the problem with the theory was not the logic, the problem was the assumption underneath the logic, the assumption that speed was something you could absorb if you were dense enough. Speed, Bruce apparently said, is not a force you absorb. Speed is a place you arrive before the other person has left. The story spread the way these stories spread, not through publications, not through official channels, but through the quiet network of serious practitioners who pass things person to person across years and borders. A fighter in Tokyo heard a version of it. A coach in Los Angeles heard a version of it. Each version changed slightly in the telling. The room got bigger, the witnesses multiplied. Kaslov's credentials inflated and deflated depending on who was speaking, but the core of it never changed. A man with every physical advantage had faced Bruce Lee with a prepared strategy, executed it with full commitment, and in 3 seconds discovered that preparation and commitment are not the same thing as understanding. Only 9 people witnessed it. 9 people inside a gray-lit training room in Hong Kong, 1972, and not one of them has ever given the full account without going quiet somewhere in the middle. Not because the memory faded, because some things, when you see them with your own eyes, don't stay in the part of the brain where normal memories live. They go somewhere deeper, somewhere that doesn't have language. The man who walked into that room as a challenger walked out of it as a different person entirely, quieter, smaller in some way that had nothing to do with his physical size. And the man who was already waiting inside, he never moved more than 3 feet, never raised his voice, never changed his expression. His name was Bruce Lee, and what happened that afternoon was never filmed, never published, never officially entered into any record of his life. But it spread, the way only true things spread, slowly, through whispers, from mouth to ear, across decades, carried by the 9 people who were present and couldn't quite bring themselves to stay silent forever. The challenger's name was Viktor Kaslov, Soviet-trained combat specialist, former military close-quarters instructor, 6'2", 230 pounds, not bodybuilder mass, functional mass, the kind built in extreme conditions over years of real training for real situations. He had been in Hong Kong 3 weeks on a diplomatic film consultation that wasn't really about film. In those 3 weeks, he had studied Bruce Lee with the cold precision of a man running a tactical assessment. He'd watched every available footage. He'd spoken to former sparring partners. He'd consulted with 2 practitioners who had faced Lee in closed demonstrations, and he had arrived at what he believed was a logical, testable conclusion.
Bruce Lee was extraordinary, but extraordinary was still physical, and physical had counters. His theory: absorb the first strike, close the distance before the second could land, get his arms around Lee, and drag the fight into a grappling contest where size and weight would end it. In a logical world, with a logical opponent, it might have worked.
No one challenged him again, not after that afternoon. Not anyone who knew what had happened in that room. And enough people knew, eventually, that the challenge requests stopped arriving the way they once had. Not because of fear, exactly, because of something harder to name. The recognition that there was a category of thing happening inside Bruce Lee's practice that was outside the normal axis of bigger versus smaller, stronger versus weaker, trained versus untrained. Bruce Lee did not become legendary because he was fast. Speed was a byproduct. He became legendary because he understood something about the nature of conflict that most people who study conflict never reach, that the goal is never to meet force with force. The goal is to not be where force arrives, to have already moved, to have already understood what was coming before it came. He called it being like water. Water doesn't resist the shape of the container. It becomes the shape. And in becoming the shape, it fills every space the container has. You cannot hit water. You cannot stop it with mass. It finds the gap you didn't know was there. Viktor Kaslov came into that room with 230 pounds of mass and a logical theory, and the full commitment of a serious, trained professional. He found the gap between his theory and the reality it couldn't account for, the gap between his speed and Bruce Lee's timing, the gap that he had spent his entire life learning to see, in opponents, in situations, in himself, and move through before anyone else even registered it existed. Bruce Lee died at 32, which means most of what he was capable of, most of what he was becoming, exists only in fragments, in the accounts of people who trained with him, faced him, watched him in rooms that had no cameras. 9 people in a gray-lit Hong Kong training room, a Soviet combat specialist who walked in with a theory and left with a different kind of knowledge, a 3-second exchange that no footage captured and no record confirms, and a lesson that outlasted the room, outlasted the participants, outlasted the decade, about what it actually means to be ready, not to be big, not to be strong, not to have a better theory, but to have moved through the gap before the theory even arrived. If this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something you can't quite name, subscribe, because there are more stories like this one, stories that didn't make the documentaries, stories that lived in rooms with no cameras, stories that are still spreading, one telling at a time, the way only true things do.